I want to thank the organizers for making this possible, for the invitation here. This is the first time I've been to Brown. I almost came to Brown as an undergraduate. I went to Oberlin because it involved taking out fewer loans. It was a better package. I'm going to be talking about, the title is Toward a Critique of Mana-Theism. So I'm using this word mana. I just want to make sure people know what I mean by mana. It's not manna from heaven. It's not the biblical manna. It was a word taken from Melanesian, introduced into European discourse in the 19th century by ethnologists and missionaries, and became like the fetish, like totem, crucial signifiers in the study of comparative religion and anthropology in the 19th century. William Mozzarella, a colleague of mine at Chicago, just wrote a book, The Mana of Mass Society, and he argues that the late 19th century was so concentrated with this word, he calls it the mana moment of the European social sciences. Let me just, Robert Codrington is the ethnologist, missionary credited for really making this word available in European social sciences. Here's one thing he writes about it in one of his books. Quote, the Melanesian mind is entirely possessed of the belief in a supernatural power or influence called almost universally mana. This is what works to affect everything which is beyond the ordinary power of men, outside the common processes of nature. It is present in the atmosphere of life, attaches itself to persons or things, and is manifested by results which can only be ascribed to its operation. And in his general theory of magic, Marcel Mauss puts it this way: this extraneous substance is invisible, marvelous, spiritual. In fact, it is the spirit which contains all efficacy and all life. It is only supernatural in a way. That is to say that mana is both supernatural and natural, since it is spread throughout the tangible world, where it is both heterogeneous and ever immanent. I love that, heterogeneous and ever immanent. Okay, so now I'm going to begin. Among the most quoted texts in the literature of anthropology, at least for non-anthropologists, is no doubt Claude Lévi-Strauss's short introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss, first published in 1950. The passages that continue to exercise an enormous force of attraction on readers are those pertaining to the notion of mana, a concept, or as Lévi-Strauss will call it, a signifier that itself functions as a name for just such forces of attraction in the primitive cultures analyzed by Mauss, as well as his uncle Emil Durkheim, among many others. Lévi-Strauss famously, people always say, I say famously argue. Okay, it's famous to me. It's like, or the well-known. Okay, it's famous. But now you're in on it. Okay. So Lévi-Strauss famously argued that mana functions in the way his two predecessors claimed, above all in their own writings. That is, they believed it. Quote, so we can see that in one case at least, the notion of mana does present those characteristics of a secret power, a mysterious force, which Durkheim and Mauss attributed to it, for such is the role it plays in their own system. Mana is really mana there. Lévi-Strauss's attempt to critique and ultimately disenchant the concept by analyzing it as a linguistic phenomenon, as the name for a structural feature of all human languages that comes to be hypostasized, treated as a substantial reality, has, it would seem, itself absorbed a remnant of the force it was meant to dissolve. I mean, people constantly go back to this text and quote it all the time. It's a talismanic text. So I would say the work of disenchantment, at least here, can exercise its own considerable charms. Lévi-Strauss's account of the emergence and persistence of notions like mana is essentially an anthropogenic one, itself structured around a conceptual impasse or aporia. So in terms of the topic of the conference, narratives of debt, what I want to say is that embedded in all narratives of debt is a kind of anthropogenic narrative and Lévi-Strauss kind of gives paradigmatic account of how this works. Becoming human, which for Lévi-Strauss means becoming a speaking being, a creature endowed with language, a qua-symbolic system, implies a gap or missing link in the diachronic dimension of its occurrence, one indexed by a synchronic discordance in the communicative flow within that system. Notions of the monotype, as Lévi-Strauss refers to them, are meant to master or bind that discordance and thereby facilitate further communicative intercourse and exchange. So this is Lévi-Strauss's very abbreviated version of the anthropogenic story. Now it's also interesting because that Agamben is very attracted to anthropogenic stories. He's basically an anthropogenic thinker. And I'm going to move on to Agamben in a minute. This is Lévi-Strauss. Whatever may have been the moment and the circumstances of its appearance in the ascent of animal life, language can only have arisen all at once. Things cannot have begun to signify gradually. In the wake of a transformation which is not a subject of study for the social sciences, but for biology and psychology, a shift occurred from a stage when nothing had meaning to another stage when everything had meaning. Actually, that apparently banal remark, I don't know why he calls it a banal remark. Actually, that apparently banal remark is important because that radical change has no counterpart in the field of knowledge, which develops slowly and progressively. In other words, at the moment when the entire universe all at once became significant, it was not the better known for being so, even if it is true that the emergence of language must have hastened the rhythm of the development of knowledge. So there is a fundamental opposition in the history of the human mind between symbolism, which is characteristically discontinuous, and knowledge characterized by continuity. End of quote. This opposition results in what Lévi-Strauss goes on to describe as a kind of chronic economic crisis pertaining to the supply and demand of efficacious signifiers, a crisis only apparently resolvable by way of a deus ex machina. This is now another quote. Namely, that man has from the start had at his disposition a signifier totality which he has at a loss to know how to allocate to a signified, given as such, but no less unknown for being given. There is always a non-equivalence or inadequation between the two, a non-fit and overspill which divine understanding alone can soak up. This generates a signifier surfeit relative to the signifieds to which it can be fitted. So in man's efforts to understand the world, he always disposes of a surplus of signification which he shares out among things in accordance with the laws of the symbolic thinking, which it is the task of ethnologists and linguists to study. That distribution of a supplementary ration is absolutely necessary to ensure that in total, the available signifier and mapped out signified may remain in the relationship of complementarity, which is the very condition of the exercise of symbolic thinking. I know this is, a lot. As already indicated, notions like mana functions as a kind of general equivalent for this surplus, this excess of signification. Lévi-Strauss variously characterized it as a floating signifier, a symbol in its pure state, and a zero symbolic value that serves as a relay or transfer point for its distribution and circulation. And this is these are all terms that became the basis for Lacan's notion of the master signifier, and the phallic signifier. And as Lévi-Strauss further adds, notions of the monotype stand surety for all art, all poetry, every mythic and aesthetic invention. So in some sense, like the humanities, like we basically are mono workers in some sense, that's where it continues. It's worth underlining a fundamental ambiguity with respect to the notions of surplus and excess. I think, for me, this is kind of the crucial thing. As already noted, the signifier surfeit, as too much signification, that notions like mana serve to bind and relay is correlated to a gap in the chain of knowledge, or perhaps better, to a knowledge that cannot be known, but only excessively signified. So, like, we talk too much because there's something we know but cannot, but that's not an impossible knowledge that we have but could only be excessively signified. And it's actually interesting. I went back to the sections on Rosenzweig on the Sabbath, and one of the things he says about the work week is that we're geschwätzig, like we just chatter. We talk too much, idle chatter. And the Sabbath is, in a certain sense, a way to cut through this excessive signification, this kind of compulsive, too much signification. Mana holds the place of something, but this emerges because there's a kind of impossible knowledge, a gap. Mana holds the place of something missing in the space of reasons, the space of possible knowledge of the world. In Lévi-Strauss's anthropogenic terms, we come into the world endowed with a distinctive sort of inadequacy. We come with something forever withheld from our comprehension, yet insisting in our lives as speaking beings. To put it in somewhat paradoxical terms, we come into the world endowed with, we might even say, invested with a surplus scarcity. And at some level, this gets to my, the question I had for Arju, where does this compulsion come from? And I think it has to do with managing a surplus scarcity. Not scarcity that can be actually satisfied, but there's a surplus scarcity we're endowed with, like invested with. And the problem is converting surplus scarcity into something that could be made good, which generates, like agitation. Slight change of direction towards psychoanalysis. I've referred several times in my work to Jonathan Lear's excellent account of the Fort-Da game described by Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle to illustrate the notion of the repetition compulsion. I'm going to cite it here again because I think it's a very nice way of trying to grasp this strange concept of surplus scarcity, what I'm calling surplus scarcity. So the Fort-Da game is, Freud describes his grandson playing with, getting agitated when his mother disappeared, and then noticing that he plays with this little object, a spool with a string, making it disappear and making it present again, saying, Fort-Da, Fort-Da. That's how Freud and Anna Freud heard it. There, gone there, gone there. So Lear emphasizes that the child's mastery of the potentially traumatic experience of his mother's absence by way of the invention or initiation into a cultural form, here a very minimal language game played with a single prop, something goes missing that cannot be properly called a loss. The game, which Lear describes as part of the prehistory of the development of the virtue of courage, is, as he puts it, prompted by a rip in the fabric of life. Quote, if we are trying to respect the child's point of view, we cannot even say that the game is prompted by a loss, for it is only after the game is installed that the child will begin to have the concept of loss or absence. Only when the game is established will the loss be a loss for the child. The outcome of the game is to convert what would have otherwise been a nameless trauma into a loss. The child had been inhabiting a less differentiated field of mother and child. It is this field that is disturbed by the mother's absence. What this ultimately means, however, is that the form of life the child now inhabits is haunted by a missing link. It's marked by the namelessness of the rip in the fabric of life that called forth the child's creative capacities in the first place. The form of life in which we have the capacity to lose because we have the concept and the name of loss is thus, in a way, not all. It can't be totalized. This is Lear again. The name of loss requires the game of loss. It requires inventing ways of living with the loss that one has just named. Once the game is established, once the child can face his loss courageously, once the mind can function according to the pleasure principle, the question of what lies beyond or before gets covered over. What gets hidden is the non-teleological occasion for courage, the disruption of the fabric of life to which courage can only be a retrospective response. Once the child can experience loss as loss, Once the child has established the game, he is no longer experiencing that which was the occasion for the development of the capacity to experience loss. If we think of a name as standing unproblematically for that which it names, then an inaugural act of naming like this always misses its mark. In this sense, facing reality always leaves something out. And it is end of quote. And it is precisely the insight into this remainder that Lear presents as Freud's crucial contribution. Quote, what does get left out, to put it paradoxically, is not another thing, but a disturbance in the fabric of life which occasioned this further development of the capacity to face reality. Freud's deepest insight, I suspect, is that appearances to the contrary, life can never be lived without remainder. Okay, that's the end of that, of Lear. To bring Freud and Lévi-Strauss together, and this, I think, is basically what Jacques Lacan did. He brought Freud and Lévi-Strauss together. There is a signifier surfeit because something has always already, I always get those confused. Something has always already gone missing from the space of meaning, which adds to life the remnant of a void that is, in a peculiar sense, less than the nothing of a loss or absence. I think this is what Zizek calls his book, less than nothing. This is what he's talking about. So it's like something gets added to life that's the remnant of a void, but it's not. But it's in a way it can't be equated with the nothing of an absence or a loss. So the surplus of signifying stress, this excessively signifying, that gets relayed into the world by way of enigmatic signifiers of the Mana type, is the mode of being of an impossible knowledge of which we can only ever be unconscious. So I want to say, so the unconscious is, one can think of it as the locus of the knowledge of surplus scarcity and sort of the elaboration of, you can't work it off, but you can elaborate it by excessively signifying, and that's kind of what the dream work is doing. Now, among the non-psychoanalytic thinkers who keep returning compulsively to Lévi-Strauss's discussion of Mana is Giorgio Agamben, a thinker who has identified his own philosophical project not so much as one of disenchantment as of the profanation of a series of magico-religious notions, above all that of the sacredness of life, that in his view continue to constrain our capacity to imagine new kinds of political affiliations and practices. And I would completely agree with Bonnie that he has no understanding of how to rehearse them. I totally agree with that. In his reflections on the institution of the oath, he has a small book on the sacrament of language about the oath. In his reflections on the oath, Agamben complains that in his otherwise helpful discussion of Mana, Lévi-Strauss remains overly fixated on the cognitive dimension of language to the detriment of its ethical or normative aspects. Quote, for the living human being who found himself speaking what must have been just as, perhaps more decisive than any cognitive limits, is the problem of the efficacy and truthfulness of his words, that is, of what can guarantee the original connection between names and things and between the subject who has become a speaker and thus capable of asserting and promising and his actions. This neglect amounts to proceeding, quote, as if the becoming human of man were solely a question of intelligence and brain size and not also one of ethos, as if intelligence and language did not also and above all pose problems of an ethical and political order, as if the Homo sapiens was not also, and of course precisely for this reason, a Homo justus. So not Homo economicus, but someone fundamentally invested in justice and sort of the ethical bindingness of one's words. Agamben's archaeology of the oath is meant to capture this fundamentally normative dimension of language, its ethical bindingness, and indeed posits the oath as he calls it, the anthropogenic operator by means of which the living being who has discovered itself speaking has decided to be responsible for his words and devoting himself to the logos to constitute himself as the living being who has language. Now, of course, this is his version of what Nietzsche calls, breeding an animal capable of making promises. He's presenting it as a decision of sorts, but that is a suddenness, all of a sudden. We're in the space of this normative space. In a more recent book, a short treatise on the concept of taste, it's actually a wonderful little book, but so where did this come from in Agamben's oeuvre? So in the short treatise on the concept of taste, the canonical treatment of which remains Kant's critique of the power of judgment, Agamben returns to the notion of mana in his efforts to capture the peculiar admixture of cognitive deficit and hedonic surplus that has been seen to inform the subject's response and peculiar responsibility before objects of beauty. So Kant famously said, we have no concept under which we subsume the beautiful object, but the claim we make that it is beautiful, we present as having a binding claim, that it's normative. Everyone ought to find this beautiful. So and the way we know that is through a kind of pleasure. So pleasure knows something that our cognition can't conceptualize. And he calls this taste. Here it is a matter not of supplementing the classification of Homo sapiens with that of Homo justus, but of unpacking the discerning sensuousness of taste. And Agamben underlines the etymological link of sapiens or sapiens with sapor, being a savant, having, savory, so we have that connection. Of unpacking the discerning sensuousness of taste, of grasping the normative knowingness proper to the enjoyment associated with this most intimate sense. And this is something also that in her lectures on Kant's theory of judgment, Arendt spends quite a bit of time sort of trying to unpack this, the most private thing is supposed to also be, open us up to the sensus communis. I don't think she succeeds, but she's on to this problem. Quote, from beginning to end, the problem of taste, this is Agamben, presents itself as that of another knowledge that cannot account for its judgments, but rather enjoys them, and of another pleasure that knows and judges. Agamben's claim is that what is tasted in the taste that informs aesthetic judgments is, much as Lévi-Strauss argued with respect to mana, not a substantial reality, but rather, and this is his version, that which in the object is pure signification. So in a certain sense, he's saying this is a kind of maniacal enjoyment, that that taste is connected to mana, which has to do with some surplus of signification, not a substance. And, so anyway, just two more pages. Two more. Extending Lévi-Strauss's reflections of mana not only to 18th century aesthetic theory, but, as he puts it, and this is a typical Agamben gesture, to all the epistemological statutes of Western culture, from the ancient world until today. Okay, let's just go with them. Agamben links mana to the amorous mania that for Plato serves as the source of divinatory knowledge. And this is connecting to Arjun's presentation yesterday, to a divinatory knowledge that, quote, cannot, as with episteme, explain itself or phenomena, but rather concerns that which in them is simply sign and appearance. End of quote. Commenting on Plato's treatment of the pair astronomy-astrology, Agamben writes, quote, ancient science left free in the phenomena what was pure appearance in them, that is, pure signifier, opening beside itself a space that divinatory science could occupy without contradiction. The phenomena saved by science, that is, in this case, astronomy, inevitably leaves behind a free residue, a remainder, a pure signifier that astrology can take as its support and treat as a supplement of signification to distribute at its whim. In the ancient world, this is still Agamben, there are thus two species of knowledge. Knowledge that is known, which is to say science in the modern sense is founded upon the adequation of signifier and signified, and knowledge that is not known, which is to say divinatory science and the various forms of mania enumerated by Plato, that is conversely founded upon the excessive signifier. Agamben's discussion of taste in the sphere of aesthetic judgment was meant to show that the post-Enlightenment decline of the divinatory sciences, their retreat in the face of the expansion of modern science, did not by any means signal the disappearance of this knowledge that is not known. He goes on to note that, quote, if aesthetics is knowledge of the excessive signifier, of the beautiful, is but a substitute for divination, it is nonetheless not the only knowledge in the modern epoch that comes to the fore after the eclipse of the divinatory sciences. It will come, end of quote, it will come as no surprise that psychoanalysis is counted among the successor sciences alongside aesthetics and what Agamben groups together under the heading of the philological disciplines. So again, we have the sense of, like what the humanities are, sort of inheriting a kind of a tradition of divinatory sciences. As Agamben succinctly puts it, Freud's science of the unconscious was, quote, instituted on the assumption that there is a knowledge that is not known, but that is revealed in symbols and signifiers. It's one of the most concise definitions, of the unconscious. And given Lévi-Strauss's understanding of mana as the general equivalent of a surplus of signification that circulates in language otherwise used to leverage our capacity for knowing and coping with the world, it should come as no surprise that Agamben then includes political economy among the successor sciences. So we have aesthetics, philology, psychoanalysis, and political economy among the successor sciences of divinatory practices. Indeed, what I've been aiming at in this discussion, now the last paragraph, what I've been aiming at in this discussion is the need to supplement the notion of the fetish, as Marx uses it in his analysis of the commodity, with another key concept imported from the colonies in the 19th century, that of mana. Against the background of my discussion of the concept, I think it becomes possible to grasp Marx's labor theory. Okay, we come now to how is it worth to save Marx's labor theory of value? This is my way. It becomes possible to grasp Marx's labor theory of value as the claim that under conditions of capitalism, the manufacture of commodities, what Marx characterized as the production of wealth, is always doubled by one of manufacture. So I'm a big pun, so that I also think that all management theory is like mana management. So there's always so the production of value, the production of use objects, use value and exchange value, I think is we're manufacturing and we're manufacturing. And Marx's point is that we're ever more governed in our lives by mana. And political economy is, in a certain sense, the science of the circulation and distribution of this excess of mana. So Marx, is always doubled by one of manufacture, the self-amplifying production of a spectral substance that he refers to as a gespenstische Gegenständlichkeit, so spectral objectivity, materiality. But this also means that the critique of political economy, as Marx envisioned it, is, as Agamben also claims, ultimately a kind of divinatory science itself, but one that knows itself to be so, to be such. This is what immanent critique, what Moïse Prouston, emphasized as that Marx is doing an immanent critique of capitalism. So it's, in a certain sense, practicing a divinatory science that knows itself to be such. Unlike classical political economy, along with its academic successors, which wants to understand itself as a social science ultimately grounded in the empirical and mathematical analysis of the wealth of nations. So again, Marx was not interested in wealth. He was interested in this other thing. This, and I think Mana, the thinking about Mana is helpful in getting our minds around what Marx was pointing to. To return to the link between Mana and mania, we could perhaps also say that what ultimately drives the process that Marx characterized as the self-valorization of value is a maniacal enjoyment, a maniacal enjoyment circling around a surplus scarcity that can never be made good, a sort of repetition compulsion at the heart of every narrative that allows us to convert that scarcity into a payable debt. So, in a way, what keeps us going is, in a way, a fantasy frame that allows this surplus scarcity to be converted into a debt, into, which also guilt, Schuld, that could be made good. And in a certain sense, in psychoanalysis, it's what's worse than having a miserable family? Having, is not knowing, just tell me why I'm a bad person. Okay, now I know how to be a bad person. Now I know that's much better than just having no idea what this agitation, where this comes from. So I prefer that, to feel guilty. I could live with that. I do live with that. So I want to say this allows, that can never be made good, a sort of repetition compulsion at the heart of every narrative that allows us to convert that scarcity into a payable debt, a conversion that makes monotheists of us all. If I might venture a final thought with respect to Bonnie's presentation, I would suggest that the cessation of, I didn't know her presentation before, but I knew the thinkers she was writing. I would suggest that the cessation of work, this is just one way to talk about inoperativity, I guess, without the additional contribution that you made. I would suggest that the cessation of work at issue in our sabbatical calling pertains not to work as such, but rather to the manufacturing process that keeps us maniacally busy working off an impossible debt, filling in a surplus scarcity that ultimately belongs, to use Arendt's term, the human condition. Thank you.